Joining me now, Democratic leader of the House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries of New York. Leader Jeffries, thanks for joining us. So your party's convention is set to kick off tomorrow. Do you think that the Democratic Party is in a better place now with Vice President Harris at the top of the ticket than it was with President Biden at the top of the ticket? And have you talked to President Biden since he dropped out of the race 4 weeks ago?
I have talked to President Biden, and let me simply say that President Biden will go down in American history as one of the most consequential presidents of all time. He made a very selfless decision to pass the torch to Vice President Harris, who's a courageous leader, a compassionate leader, and a common sense leader. And she's ready, she's willing, she's able to get the job done. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm, and a lot of energy with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz at the top of the ticket. And we're looking forward to a very joyful Democratic National Convention.
Vice President Harris unveiled some of her economic platform on Friday. One key platform plank was her plan to ban price gouging for grocery prices. Jason Furman, who was the top economist for President Obama, said that her plan is not a good idea. Quote, "The good case scenario is price gouging is a message, not a reality. The bad case scenario is that this is a real proposal. You'll end up with bigger shortages, less supply, and ultimately risk higher prices and worse outcomes for consumers if you try to enforce this in a real way, which I don't know if they would or wouldn't do," unquote. Do you plan to support Vice President Harris's plan to ban price gouging?
Kamala Harris has articulated a very important plan to make sure that we are lowering costs for everyday Americans, that we are ending price gouging throughout the country, and that, of course, we are growing the middle class and making sure that everyday Americans can get ahead. So we as House Democrats look forward to working with Kamala Harris to drive costs down. We've done some of that work in terms of driving down the high price of life-saving prescription drugs for millions of Americans, including capping the price of insulin at $35 per hour. We've lowered the cost of internet availability and in several other areas, but we recognize that there is more work that needs to be done because there are far too many Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck, struggling each and every month, and we've got to drive down costs, including the cost of groceries.
Well, the Washington Post editorial board said blaming big business or corporations was a, quote, gambit. The San Francisco Federal Reserve found little evidence that price gouging was the main culprit behind inflation, floating supply chains and production costs instead. Isn't part of the problem here when it comes to high prices and inflation the fact that you and your colleagues on Capitol Hill, along with both President Trump and President Biden, infused the economy with perhaps too much cash because of the pandemic?
The challenge is that President Biden and Vice President Harris inherited 3 different catastrophes from the prior president at the same time. There was a public health catastrophe connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. There was an economic catastrophe that resulted from the shutdown of our economy. And of course, there was a democracy catastrophe related to the January 6th violent assault on the Capitol incited by the former president as part of the effort to halt the peaceful transfer of power. And so in the context of the economic catastrophe, the shutdown of the economy had consequences. And when demand came back, the supply chain needed to, of course, catch up. And so that is a process that has been underway that has triggered an inflationary environment. But it's fair to say that part of the challenge that many everyday Americans have felt is that price gouging is occurring by some bad actors. And it's reasonable for us to look into how we can stop it from occurring. Vice President Harris is simply saying we have to make sure that markets are properly functioning. That's the American way.
We're here in Chicago where Democrats are expecting tens of thousands of anti-Israel protesters who have been calling President Biden, quote, Genocide Joe for months. An effort called Abandon Biden says that they are not yet targeting Vice President Harris, but a spokesperson told Reuters, quote, the clock is ticking and our patience is running out. Do you see a policy difference between President Biden and Vice President Harris when it comes to Israel and Gaza?
Well, President Biden and Vice President Harris have been working hard to try to bring about a peace agreement that has been on the table over the last few weeks to try to get that to closure. It's a very necessary thing to accomplish. It will allow for, of course, a ceasefire to be put in place for the hostages to be returned home. Those are both Israeli hostages and American hostages, for us to surge humanitarian assistance into Gaza so we can help out Palestinian civilians who are in harm's way through no fault of their own, and also, of course, to lay the foundation for a just and lasting peace between a safe and secure Israel and the opportunity for the Palestinian people to receive the dignity and the self-determination that they deserve. That's what is on the table right now, and we are squarely behind that effort led by President Biden, joined by Vice President Harris, and of course supported by Secretary Blinken, who is in the region right now to try to get this peace agreement done.
Former President Trump is making a big push to get black voters to come to his side. I wanted to get your reaction to something President Trump said recently about Vice President Harris and her race at an event for black journalists. Take a listen.
I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
What was your response when you heard that?
It was a very ignorant statement made by the former president, but we should not be surprised because this is someone who's often engaged in racial arson to try to inflame passions amongst the American people in a very unproductive way. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are running a forward-looking, joyful campaign. The difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is as wide as the Grand Canyon. Kamala Harris is about unity. Donald Trump is about division. Kamala Harris is about the future. Donald Trump represents the past. Kamala Harris will build an economy that allows the middle class and everyday Americans to get ahead. Donald Trump wants to go back to an economy where his main emphasis is big tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. So we're going to continue to be part of, led by Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, a joyful, forward-looking campaign that brings the American people together, that is designed to deliver real results for everyday Americans and solve problems for hardworking American taxpayers. We'll leave the chaos, the division, and the extremism to Donald Trump and the Republicans.
Donald Trump and his allies are already starting to lay the groundwork to contest the election results in November. Are you confident that a Republican-led House will certify the 2024 election in January?
I'm confident that we're going to do everything that we need to do over the next few months to make sure that House Democrats take back the majority so that the American people do not have to encounter that question. It is a reality that far too many of my extreme MAGA Republican colleagues in the House have engaged in election denial, conspiracy theories, and have tried to undermine the very fabric of our democracy and the peaceful transfer of power. By the way, Jake, that's what Trump's Project 2025 is all about. The extreme MAGA Republicans want total control over the lives of the American people, total control over our government, and total control over our democracy, and we've got to stop it from happening.
Leader Hakeem Jeffries of New York, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'll